I'm gonna tase you, dude.
These guys are ridiculous.
Yeah, we are.
They're violating my Fourth Amendment constitutional rights.
Oh yeah, that's code 440th place west of Central. Suspects in custody.
In this shocking incident, Louisiana deputies wrongly...
The architecture of wrongful detention rarely announces itself with sirens and drawn weapons. More often it arrives in the mundane. A lunch break, a parked car, a moment of ordinary stillness shattered by the arrival of uniformed authority operating on incomplete information and unchecked assumption. What unfolded in Los Angeles County in this incident represents something far more systemic than a single case of mistaken identity. It exposes the mechanical process by which American law enforcement transforms innocent citizens into suspects, suspects into resistors, and resistors into defendants, all within minutes, all captured on body-worn cameras that were ostensibly deployed to prevent exactly this kind of institutional failure. Jamal Williams was 40 years old. He was eating lunch. These two facts would prove central to everything that followed, yet they were functionally irrelevant to the deputies who approached his vehicle with their minds already constructed around a narrative that had no room for his actual identity. The dispatch information described a burglary suspect, young, black, early 20s, wearing all black with possibly a red shirt underneath. Williams was 20 years older than the described suspect. He was wearing a maroon sweatshirt. The color distinction between red and maroon might seem minor in casual conversation, but in the context of suspect identification, such details represent the difference between reasonable suspicion and arbitrary selection based on race alone. The initial contact establishes the template for everything that follows. An officer approaches and immediately asks whether Williams lives in the area, a question that carries embedded assumptions about belonging, about who has the right to occupy space without explanation, about which bodies require justification for their presence in a given location. Before Williams can process the encounter, hands are moving toward him, and his instinctive response, "Don't touch me," triggers the first escalation. This moment deserves careful examination because it reveals the paradox at the heart of modern policing. Citizens are simultaneously told they have rights and punished for attempting to exercise them. The officer's explanation arrives fragmented and insufficient. You match the description of somebody that just committed a burglary. This statement, presented as justification, actually reveals the poverty of the basis for detention. Matching a description is not the same as being identified as a perpetrator. Matching a description requires, at minimum, that the descriptive elements actually align. A 40-year-old man does not match the description of someone in their early 20s. A maroon sweatshirt does not match the description of all black clothing with a possible red underlayer. These are not subtle distinctions requiring expert analysis. They are obvious discrepancies visible to anyone willing to look, rather than simply confirm pre-existing suspicion. The body camera becomes a point of contention almost immediately. Williams, aware that recording exists and presumably understanding that such recording should protect him from misconduct, asks whether the camera is on. The officer confirms it is. This exchange should theoretically establish a framework of accountability. Both parties know the encounter is documented. Both parties should moderate their behavior accordingly. Instead, the confirmation of recording appears to have no moderating effect on the officer's conduct whatsoever. This represents one of the most significant failures of the body camera revolution in American policing. The presence of recording equipment does not automatically produce accountability if officers believe correctly, in many jurisdictions, that the footage will be reviewed by colleagues predisposed to justify their actions. Williams invokes his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and requests an attorney. These are textbook assertions of constitutional protections. The exact behaviors that civics education teaches citizens to employ during encounters with law enforcement. The response from deputies is not de-escalation, not acknowledgement of rights, not a pause to reassess the situation. The response is physical. Hands reach into the vehicle. Commands multiply and overlap. The word resisting enters the encounter despite Williams having done nothing more than fail to immediately comply with orders to exit his vehicle. Orders that, given the flawed basis for the stop itself, arguably lacked lawful foundation. The legal threshold for requiring a citizen to exit a vehicle during a detention is established, but not unlimited. Pennsylvania v. Mims and subsequent cases do grant officers the authority to order drivers out of vehicles during lawful stops for officer safety purposes. However, this authority assumes the underlying stop is itself lawful, based on reasonable, articulable suspicion of criminal activity. When the factual basis for suspicion consists entirely of race plus approximate clothing color, the stop itself rests on constitutionally questionable ground. The order to exit inherits this constitutional deficiency. Williams's hesitation to comply, therefore, exists in a legal gray zone that officers on scene made no effort to navigate thoughtfully. Instead of thoughtfulness, the encounter receives escalation. The threat of electroshock, "I'm going to tase you," enters the interaction. A taser deployment constitutes use of force, a category of police action that requires justification proportional to the threat faced. What threat did Williams pose while seated in his vehicle, eating lunch, asserting his rights, and asking that the encounter be recorded? The threat was non-compliance, which is not the same as danger. The threat was a citizen who knew enough about his rights to articulate them, which is not the same as a citizen posing physical risk to officer safety. The threat fundamentally was to officer authority, and this category of threat, while intensely felt by law enforcement personnel, does not satisfy legal standards for force deployment. The presence of bystanders who begin recording represents a crucial evolution in modern police encounters, where once such incidents occurred in isolation, witnessed only by the involved parties and therefore subject to the epistemological asymmetry of officer testimony versus civilian testimony. The proliferation of smartphone cameras has democratized documentation. The bystanders here capture angles and audio that supplement the body-worn camera footage, creating a multi-perspective record that makes post hoc narrative manipulation significantly more difficult. The officers acknowledge this recording, even seeming to welcome it at certain moments, suggesting a confidence that their conduct will be viewed as appropriate. This confidence itself requires examination. When officers engage in what objective observers might view as excessive force, while apparently unconcerned about documentation, it suggests either a genuine belief in the righteousness of their actions or an institutional confidence that documented misconduct carries no meaningful consequences. Williams is pulled from the vehicle. The physical mechanics of this extraction matter because they define the nature of force applied. Hands grip arms, bodies shift and pull. The term control holds appears in subsequent officer descriptions of the encounter, a clinical phrase that sanitizes the fundamental reality of state agents physically compelling a citizen to move against his expressed will, based on a suspect description he did not match. The control hold is a technique. The policy question is when such techniques become appropriate and whether their application here cleared that threshold. The officers will later describe their actions as minimal necessary force. The footage suggests an alternative interpretation. Force was applied not as a last resort after de-escalation failed, but as an immediate response to non-instant compliance. The ground becomes the next destination for Williams. A little takedown, in the words of one deputy. The diminutive adjective does rhetorical work, minimizing the violence of forcing a human body to the ground, obscuring the risk of injury inherent in such maneuvers, reframing aggression as professionalism. Williams is pinned. His legs are restrained. The hobble restraint, which binds ankles and connects them to handcuffs, renders him immobile, eliminating any theoretical threat he might have posed, while simultaneously eliminating his capacity for self-protection if any harm were to come to him. This level of restraint typically corresponds to subjects who have demonstrated violent resistance. The footage shows no such resistance from Williams. Only the crime of failing to immediately comply with orders he had legal grounds to question. 12 officers would ultimately respond to this scene. 12 representatives of state authority mobilized to address one man's lunch break. The resource allocation alone tells a story about institutional priorities and about the self-reinforcing nature of police escalation. Each additional unit that arrives encounters a scene already framed as resistant subject, burglary suspect, officer safety concern. Each additional officer absorbs this framing without independent assessment of whether the foundational suspicion was ever valid. The multiplication of force becomes its own justification. Surely all these officers wouldn't be here if something serious wasn't happening. The circular logic completes itself, and Williams remains on the ground, restrained, waiting for someone to notice that he is not the person they were seeking. The vehicle search commences with officers explicitly stating their objective. Locate the mask and cap worn by the actual burglary suspect, items captured in photographs taken by an informant. This stated objective inadvertently reveals the weakness of the case against Williams. If the search is necessary to confirm whether he is the suspect, then the detention occurred before confirmation was possible. The sequence is backwards. Proper procedure would involve developing reasonable suspicion before detention, not detaining first and then searching for evidence to retroactively justify the detention. The officers appear unaware of or indifferent to this procedural inversion. Williams, from his position of physical helplessness, asserts his Fourth Amendment rights. He does not consent to the vehicle search, and the officers proceed regardless, presumably under the theory that the search is incident to arrest or justified by probable cause. But the arrest itself is for resisting, a charge that cannot exist independently, but must be attached to some lawful underlying police action. If the original detention lacked legal foundation, Then the resistance charge collapses, and the search incident to that arrest becomes constitutionally suspect. This is the nested logic of Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, where each police action must justify itself in relation to prior actions, and an unlawful route contaminates the entire tree of subsequent conduct. The search produces nothing incriminating. No mask, no cap, no connection whatsoever to the burglary that supposedly justified this entire encounter. This is the moment when rational law enforcement practice would dictate immediate release, accompanied by an apology. The suspect description has been thoroughly invalidated. The physical evidence connecting Williams to any crime is non-existent. The basis for continued detention has evaporated entirely. What happens instead reveals the institutional logic that governs American policing far more accurately than training manuals or policy documents. The officers decide to maintain the arrest. The charge will be resisting arrest under California Penal Code Section 148. This decision represents a remarkable inversion of justice. Williams was detained based on mistaken identity. He was physically extracted from his vehicle. He asserted his rights. He was threatened with electroshock. He was forced to the ground. He was restrained hand and foot. He was searched without his consent. And when all of this produced no evidence of wrongdoing on his part, when every single action premised on his alleged criminality proved unfounded, the response of law enforcement was not release, but punishment for his conduct during the encounter. The original sin of the detention vanishes into procedural memory, and Williams is held accountable for his response to treatment that should never have occurred. This charge, resisting arrest, functions in the American criminal justice system as a kind of all-purpose fallback for law enforcement seeking to justify encounters that produced no other criminal evidence. Its application here follows a depressingly common pattern. Aggressive police conduct generates citizen pushback. That pushback, however minor or legally justified, becomes its own crime. The citizen is arrested not for the thing they were suspected of, but for their response to being suspected. The circularity is complete. The system protects itself by criminalizing the friction it creates. The supervisor who arrives on scene receives a briefing from the involved deputies. This briefing is itself documented on body camera, providing a record of how officers characterize their own conduct when reporting to authority figures within the department. The language is careful and professionally sanitized. Control holds. Take down to the ground. He refused to get out. Each phrase does specific work, framing officer conduct as minimal and proportional, while framing civilian conduct as resistant and problematic. The narrative shapes perception, and perception shapes accountability. What the supervisor does not do is equally significant. There is no evidence of critical questioning of the deputy's description match assessment. There is no apparent concern about the age discrepancy between the suspect description and the detained individual. There is no documented pause to assess whether the force used was proportional to any actual threat posed. The supervisor's role appears to be bureaucratic rather than evaluative, processing the incident into departmental paperwork rather than assessing whether the incident should have occurred at all. Williams, from the back of a patrol vehicle, attempts to engage with officers about why he is being held. His questions are deflected. His assertions of rights are met with procedural responses, We'll figure that out. We'll talk when you get there. The asymmetry of information is total. The officers know what they intend to do with him. Williams knows only that he was having lunch and is now restrained in a police vehicle. His request for explanation is not a demand, but a plea for basic procedural comprehension, and it is denied. The hospital question arises: should Williams receive medical evaluation before transport to jail? The answer depends on assessment of his physical condition following the takedown and restraint. That such assessment is necessary speaks to the force involved in his detention. That the officers appear uncertain about procedure speaks to the institutional processes surrounding use of force documentation. Every injury requires documentation. Documentation requires evaluation. Evaluation requires time. The preference for avoiding this process is implicit in the officer's demeanor. The preference for jail over hospital reflects a disposition toward punishment over care. The Bodycam footage captures something that will prove significant in subsequent litigation: the officer's confidence. At no point in the recorded encounter do the deputies appear concerned that their actions might be reviewed negatively. There is no visible anxiety about the cameras. There is no whispered discussion about whether they might have made a mistake. The confidence is complete, and it derives from institutional experience. These officers have operated within a system that has trained them to expect protection for their decisions, to anticipate that internal review will validate their conduct, to believe that documentation serves their interests rather than the interests of the citizens they detain. This confidence was likely well-founded historically. Whether it will survive the particular scrutiny of this case remains to be seen. The informant's photographs of the actual suspect eventually become relevant to the investigation. The suspect in those photographs is wearing all black, is in his early 20s, and was spotted in a location half a mile from where Williams was eating lunch. Setting aside the clothing and age mismatch, the proximity-based logic of the detention also fails scrutiny. Half a mile is a significant distance. A suspect fleeing on foot might cover that distance, but so might any number of other people going about their ordinary lives. The zone of suspicion radiating from a crime scene must have some boundary, some limiting principle preventing police from detaining every person who shares a single demographic characteristic with a fleeing suspect. Here, that limiting principle failed catastrophically. The aftermath of the vehicle search produces a particular variety of institutional awkwardness. Officers have invested significant resources, personnel time, physical force, into an encounter that has produced no evidence of wrongdoing. The sunk cost problem now influences decision-making. To release Williams would be to acknowledge error. Acknowledgement of error carries professional risk. The charge of resisting provides a face-saving alternative, a way to process the encounter into the system without admitting that the encounter should never have happened. Williams becomes collateral damage in the protection of institutional reputation. The criminal processing of Jamal Williams continues despite the complete absence of evidence connecting him to any burglary. He is transported to jail. He is booked on the resisting charge. He will spend time in custody. He will require legal representation. His life will be disrupted in ways large and small, all stemming from the decision of officers to approach his vehicle based on a description he did not match, and to escalate based on his assertion of rights they were trained to recognize but not to respect. The civil rights lawsuit filed in January 2022 represents Williams's attempt to obtain accountability through channels other than the criminal justice system that failed him. His claims include racial profiling, excessive force, and unlawful seizure, a constellation of constitutional violations that, if proven, establish a pattern of misconduct requiring remedy. Legal experts assessing the case identify significant strengths in Williams's position: the documented description, mismatch, the recorded use of force, the decision to charge despite exonerating evidence, and the apparent absence of meaningful internal review following the incident. The racial profiling claim rests on the documented gap between the suspect description and Williams's actual appearance. The fact that both the suspect and Williams are black does not create reasonable suspicion. Race alone has never been sufficient basis for detention under constitutional standards. The description specified age and clothing, and Williams matched neither. The officer's decision to detain him therefore relied on something other than the objective description elements, and that something, Williams's lawsuit argues, was race-based assumption about criminality, presence, and belonging. The excessive force claim focuses on the escalation from verbal encounter to physical extraction, the threat of taser deployment, the takedown to the ground, and the hobble restraint. Each of these applications of force must be assessed against the threat actually posed at the moment of application. Williams posed no physical threat while seated in his vehicle. He made no aggressive movements. His non-compliance was verbal and legal, rather than physical and threatening. The force used was therefore disproportionate to any legitimate law enforcement need, serving instead to compel obedience through pain and physical dominance. The unlawful seizure claim encompasses the detention as a whole, arguing that from the moment officers approached Williams based on a description he did not match, the constitutional clock began running on an encounter that lacked lawful foundation. Every subsequent action, the vehicle exit command, the physical extraction, the restraint, the search, the transport to jail, flows from this initially unlawful seizure and inherits its constitutional deficiency. The deputies involved continue to work during the pendency of litigation. This fact speaks to the protective mechanisms of police employment, where allegations of misconduct rarely result in immediate consequences, and where the presumption of innocence accorded to accused citizens is extended far more generously to accused officers. The lawsuit proceeds on its own timeline, separated from the daily reality of these officers patrolling the same streets, stopping other vehicles, making other decisions about who matches descriptions and who does not. The taxpayer liability question hovers over proceedings of this nature. When civil rights lawsuits against police departments result in settlements or verdicts, the funds come from municipal budgets rather than individual officer bank accounts. This financial insulation removes the most direct form of accountability from officer decision-making. An officer who knows that any lawsuit will be paid by the city has different incentives than an officer who might personally bear the cost of wrongful conduct. The insurance function of municipal liability protection systematically undermines the deterrent purpose of civil rights litigation. Internal investigation procedures receive scrutiny in cases like Williams's. The independence of such investigations is perpetually questioned, given that investigators are typically members of the same department, colleagues and sometimes friends of the officers under review. The pattern of investigation outcomes, overwhelming clearance of officers, minimal discipline, even in documented cases of misconduct, suggests that internal accountability mechanisms serve more to validate than to police behavior. Calls for civilian oversight, independent prosecutors, and external review boards derive from recognition that self-policing has fundamental structural limitations. The body camera footage in this case was preserved and eventually became part of the public record through litigation and journalistic investigation. This preservation was not guaranteed. Departments across the country have established varying policies on camera activation, footage retention, and public access. Officers sometimes fail to activate cameras. Footage sometimes disappears before it can be reviewed. Access requests sometimes face bureaucratic delay until public attention has moved on. The fact that this footage survived and reached public view represents a best-case documentation scenario. Yet even perfect documentation did not prevent the original misconduct from occurring. The broader pattern within which this incident sits involves the disproportionate targeting of Black Americans by law enforcement, a pattern documented across decades of academic study, Department of Justice investigations, and lived experience. Williams's encounter fits the template. A Black man in a space where his presence was not assumed, approached based on minimal description match, treated as threat despite exhibiting no threatening behavior, punished for asserting rights rather than immediately complying. The statistical probability of this encounter happening to a white man eating lunch in a similar vehicle in a similar location is calculably lower, not because white men don't commit burglaries, but because white presence does not generate the same presumption of suspicion that triggers these stops. The training implications of incidents like Williams's are theoretically significant but practically limited. Police academies and continuing education programs incorporate instruction on constitutional limitations, de-escalation techniques, and bias recognition. Yet the translation from classroom to street is inconsistent. Officers who know the legal standards for reasonable suspicion demonstrate in practice that knowing standards and following them are different things. The organizational culture of policing, with its emphasis on authority, control, and officer safety, often overwhelms the legal limitations that are supposed to cabin that authority. The institutional protection of officers following questionable conduct reinforces the behaviors that generate civil rights lawsuits. When deputies observe that colleagues who engage in aggressive stops and escalated force face no internal consequences, they internalize the lesson that such behavior is acceptable, perhaps even preferred. The department's response to the Williams incident in real time, supervisor accepting the deputy's account, charges filed against Williams, no immediate indication of concern about the description mismatch, transmitted a message to all officers present that this is how the system works. Williams's year-long legal battle represents not only his personal pursuit of accountability, but also a test of whether the system contains meaningful corrective mechanisms. The outcome of his civil case will determine financial consequences, but not criminal ones. No officer in this incident has faced criminal charges for their conduct. The asymmetry between citizen and officer accountability remains intact. Williams was arrested for resisting. The officers who detained him without reasonable suspicion, threatened him with weapons, and forced him to the ground face no comparable criminal exposure. The documentation function of body cameras realizes its potential only when the footage is subject to meaningful review by parties with authority to impose consequences. A camera that records misconduct, but whose footage is reviewed only by departmental colleagues predisposed to justify that misconduct is a camera that documents rather than deters. The footage from this encounter provides clear evidence of the description mismatch, the force used, the rights asserted and ignored. Whether that evidence produces accountability depends on institutions beyond the department itself: courts, juries, federal civil rights monitors, journalists, the public. The perpetual reform cycle of American policing, scandal, outrage, committee, report, recommendation, implementation, fade, next scandal, continues with each documented incident of misconduct. Williams's case enters this cycle as one data point among many, one story among thousands, one black man wrongfully detained among a multitude whose encounters never receive documentation or attention. The structural conditions that generated his encounter remain in place. Vague descriptions that allow race-based stops, force authorization that defers to officer perception of threat, charging decisions that punish resistance to unlawful action, internal review that protects rather than disciplines. The footage ends, but the system continues. Officers complete their shifts, reports are filed. Williams is processed through jail, lawyers prepare briefs, taxpayers unknowingly fund the defense of those who detained their fellow citizen. And somewhere, right now, another person whose appearance approximately matches some description is being approached by officers operating under the same training, the same institutional pressures, the same confidence that their actions will be protected. The machinery requires no animus to produce its outcomes, only the inertia of procedures designed to protect the system from accountability. Jamal Williams spent over a year seeking justice for an incident that began with lunch. The officers spent no comparable time questioning whether they should have approached him at all,